As I'm sure you're tired of me hammering home, competing claims on renewable resources are pretty much omnipresent. However, violent conflict over them is not. Most of the time, competing claims are handled through market transactions, or decided by domestic law, or adjudicated through the courts or international treaties and negotiation. For example, the United States and Canada have an ongoing dispute over the international boundary of the Beaufort Sea in the Arctic Circle, which may hold vast untapped fisheries and natural gas deposits. But those competing claims have been handled peacefully through bilateral negotiations. I'm guessing none of you went to sleep last night worried about a Canada-US maritime war. Well, why might that be? Violence is costly, both for the participants and, as is often the case, for the underlying resource. Violence is by definition risky behavior. It is, for most people, and states for that matter, the last resort for resolving a dispute. The risk of personal harm or death is omnipresent. It also takes time and resources away from productive activities. If you're a farmer on the edge of subsistence, you'd probably much rather invest your time and money in fertilizer and seed than in buying an AK-47 rifle, no matter how cheap it might be. And finally, it can be very damaging to the underlying resource. If your goal, for example, is to get back your stolen cattle, and bullets start flying, several of those prized animals might be caught and killed in the crossfire. This is true at the interstate level as well. The bargaining model of war, which has come to influence a lot of contemporary thinking about armed conflict, operates from the observation that precisely because conflict consumes both blood and treasure, there is always some alternative to conflict that would leave the parties better off than fighting. And this is true even in cases like the US invasion of Iraq, where the battlefield outcome was never really in doubt. Thus, to explain the occurrence of armed conflict, you have to explain why bargaining breaks down, or does not occur in the first place. We'll come back to that in a couple weeks. So if most environmental conflicts are handled peacefully, in what kinds of contexts are environmental conflicts likely to turn violent? As we've discussed previously, competing claims over renewable resources are omnipresent. Even in wealthy countries, population growth and increased wealth seem to push demand for land, water, and other resources ever upward. Actual armed conflict is more rare. We'll save a discussion of the contextual factors as they affect interstate conflicts, like territorial conquest, water wars, and maritime disputes for later. At the domestic level, i.e. with respect to conflicts within states like distributive conflict, sons of the soil conflict, conflict to prevent environmental degradation, and environmentally sparked conflicts, there are four contextual factors that are most important. First, demographic and environmental stress, or what Colin Call calls DES and Thomas Homer Dixon calls genesis of scarcity. 2, state capacity and legitimacy. 3, dependence on rural livelihoods. And 4, groupness, or the degree to which individuals in society depend on distinct identity groups like ethnicity or religion for their economic prospects, physical security, and as a platform to pursue political power. We'll take each of those in turn. First, some type of demographic and environmental stress is usually present. Demographic and environmental stress, or DES, is a three-pronged concept comprising rapid population growth, the degradation and overexploitation of renewable resources, such as arable land or water, and unequal access to those resources within society, particularly unequal across social groups. Let's briefly break it into its two core components. Let's start with demographic pressures and rapid population growth. Rapid population growth puts a lot of stress on social and economic systems. More mouths to feed, more people in need of education and employment, and more people in need of opportunities for having a meaningful, healthy future. That is, for achieving human development. All countries face some challenges that are a function of their demography. For an aging population, like Germany, the challenge is a large elderly population relative to the working age population. For a country like Niger, however, the problem is a massive youth bulge, a product of reductions in infant mortality that take place before the fertility transition, after which women have fewer children. 61% of all people in Niger are under the age of 20. That's a lot of people who need education and prospects to better themselves. Youth bulges are important because across types of conflict, it's typically the young that participate. A bigger youth bulge means more people willing and able to man the barricades or raid cattle. I'd argue the most dangerous age for most people is between the ages of 15 and 25, when they're large and physically developed enough to be a real threat, but without fully formed impulse control. The second is environmental stress, which can be a function of both population growth but also mismanagement of resources resulting in a significant loss in resource productivity or the ability of the resource to regenerate. This concept is closely related to carrying capacity, or the maximum population size that can be sustained indefinitely by an environment and its associated renewable resources of food, water, and other ecosystem services. Some of these stressors are largely environmental. Fish die-offs caused by reduced oxygen in the water due to high temperatures or algal blooms are one example. Others, like the famed Dust Bowl of the early 20th century, were the result of a combination of overgrazing and cropping practices that did not take into account the plains' arid conditions and high winds, that is, an interaction between human practices and the physical environment. Add these two stressors together, and you get demographic environmental stress. Let's take, for example, arable land, a valuable resource in a place like Niger, where 75% of the labor force still works in agriculture, meaning access to land is central to livelihoods. In 1970, there were 2.5 hectares of arable land per capita. 2.5 hectares is about equivalent to 2.5 rugby pitches like the one seen here. By 2020, population growth and desertification had reduced arable land per capita to about 0.8 of 1 hectare, less than a third of the earlier value. And agricultural productivity in Niger has far from tripled. This brings us to the third prong, unequal access to these resources within society. Niger has a mostly arid or semi-arid climate. The arable land that is there is concentrated in the southern regions of the country, especially around the Lake Chad Basin, which is that dark green spot on the southeastern border, and the Niger River, which flows through southwestern Niger and through the capital, Niamey. Looking at a map of ethnic homelands in Niger, we can see that these areas are dominated by the Kanuri, Zama, and Songhai, and Hausa ethnic groups, while the Tuareg and Tubu to the north are relegated to much more arid conditions. The Tuareg minority has been either powerless, holding no political power at either the national or regional level, or actively discriminated against for most of Niger's post-independence history. The Nigerian state has virtually no presence in this vast, sparsely populated region, save for its presence in the mineral-rich central highlands around Agadez. When these stresses and unequal access aren't present, these resources are scarcely worth fighting and dying over. But when they are more scarce or malapportioned, i.e. held unequally by different groups within society, they might be. Jack Goldstone would probably add another category to this concept, the availability of positions or avenues for upward mobility. In societies where these options are very limited, such as in caste systems or the feudal systems of Europe, there were very few vehicles for trying to ensure your children would have a shot of not doing what you did for a living, if you were a peasant. In more open economic systems, these options are more prevalent. What do you think happens when an entire generation feels their upward mobility has been limited? Second, state capacity and legitimacy are key. State capacity is the ability of the state to mobilize resources and enforce its territorial monopoly on the legitimate use of force. When state capacity is high, these environmental conflicts are almost always channeled through legitimate legal and political institutions, like courts and legislatures, or handled effectively by strong professional militaries and security forces. Similarly, legitimacy matters for whether these state institutions are viewed as fair and impartial, as when institutions, especially courts, are viewed as legitimate and impartial arbiters of conflict, and the use of violence to settle disputes will be met with criminal charges and punishment. If there are legitimate institutions and channels for managing and adjudicating conflict, most parties will avail themselves of them. In many parts of the developing world, and increasingly in the middle-income and developed world, these institutions are either weak, courts and police officers are neither physically close enough to the disputes, like in our West Texas example from an earlier lecture, nor powerful enough to contain them, or they're viewed with deep skepticism, i.e. they lack legitimacy. In these contexts, disputes often involve participants taking matters into their own hands, and perhaps most dangerously, these conflicts are really likely to boil over into an armed rebellion when state institutions for resolving disputes are viewed as being partial to or favoring one side of the conflict over the other. We'll talk about that at length next week. Alternatively, disputes might be taken up in informal institutions, like with village or tribal elders or local religious leaders, who may not be seen as legitimate by all parties. The modern state system dates only to 1648. It's not like before that there were no dispute resolution channels other than the way of the sword. Within communities, there are plenty of disputes that are solved through completely informal channels based on ethnic or religious ties. And sometimes the elites of these communities play a very important role in managing conflict between groups. Don't take it from me, take it from David Layton, professor of political science at Stanford. David Layton has already forgotten more insights than I'll ever learn about ethnic politics and ethnic conflict, but he began one of his seminal articles on the subject with the following anecdote. I grew up in a Jewish section of Flatbush that bordered an Italian neighborhood. Sometimes on our way to school, some Italian kids, nearly all of them went to parochial schools, would hassle and even attack us. Although they lived only a few blocks away, we didn't even know their names. We just called them the St. Brennan's kids. Our parents would see our injuries and report the incidents to our school principal, who was Jewish, but from a different neighborhood. He contacted the relevant authorities at St. Brennan's, who would investigate the matter and punish the culprits. The funny thing was, no one ever seemed to think of calling the police. They were Irish. That is, the peace is kept because leaders, like the principals in this scenario, from different groups see a long-term benefit to keeping the peace, and thus self-police their own groups to try and keep the kind of spiraling discussed in Sons of the Soil conflicts from occurring. Recall that spiraling is when transgressions are met with ever larger tit-for-tat responses, the escalation from a one-on-one fight to an all-out brawl or riot, or the escalation from a fist to a bat to a knife to a gun, fueled by a desire for revenge, fear of being attacked and wanting to take the initiative, and even rumor. This is one reason why cattle-based communal conflicts occur so frequently in the Sahel. Because the tribes are migratory, unlike the Jewish and Catholic educators in David Layton's childhood neighborhood, these tribal elites may not know one another all that well. A tribe may view their elders as legitimate dispute adjudicators, but probably doesn't view other tribes' elders as legitimate, to say nothing of impartial. When state institutions, and therefore state capacity, are weak, environmental conflict is more likely to turn violent. The third factor that determines when environmental conflicts are likely to turn violent is when renewable resources are central to livelihoods and well-being. That is, when people need to physically live off the land. Singapore is remarkably overcrowded in the sense that it produces little food and has exceptionally high population density. However, vanishingly few Singaporeans are engaged in farming, with the vast majority of them involved in manufacturing or services. More broadly, direct access to natural resources like land and water is not central to most livelihoods in the developed world. In the countries of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD, like the United States, Germany, and France, only 1 to 3% of the population works in agriculture. In contrast, agriculture is the primary source of employment in most developing countries. In Ethiopia and Rwanda and Uganda, agriculture employs roughly 3 out of every 4 people in the workforce. In a place like Nepal, the share is closer to 2 out of 3. Less developed countries typically do not have vast systems of water management and irrigation for agriculture, meaning that agricultural productivity is almost entirely determined by weather conditions. In these predominantly rural societies, direct access to land and water is much more tied to the ability to provide for one's family, making violent conflict over threats to renewable resource access more likely in these contexts. A fourth factor that helps us understand when and where environmental conflicts are likely to turn violent is groupness. In societies with high groupness, ethnic, religious, and/or clan identities are vehicles to economic opportunity and political participation. They also determine who receives political benefits from those in power. These identities tend to be ascriptive, in the sense that they are identities individuals are born into and are relatively hard to change. In many developing countries, these identities form the basis for political office seeking. In ethnically homogeneous countries, like the Republic of Korea, and extremely ethnically diverse countries, like Tanzania, there's low groupness. Ethnic identities are not highly salient, or important or useful for political mobilization. In contrast, in countries like Iraq, with Sunni Arabs, Shia Arabs, and Kurds, Burundi and Rwanda, with Tutsis and Hutus, and Myanmar, with the Bamar, Shan, Kayan, Rakhine, Mon, Kachin, Rohingya, and other ethnic groups, political cleavages and patronage networks break along identity-based lines, making groupness high. Now, groupness is a flexible concept because of the nature of racial, ethnic, and religious identity is highly context-dependent. In the U.S., groupness revolves around racial categories, but this would make little sense in a place like Kenya, where groupness is just as high or even higher than in the U.S. context. In that context, it's around ethnic identity. There, ethnic identities simply matter more. In Somalia, for example, groupness is based on clan networks and affiliation. Groupness matters for 2 main reasons. First, in societies with high groupness, individuals are already embedded in communities and networks of action. It's easier to identify one's team and facilitate cooperation and coordination, including coordinating to engage in violent activities. This kind of mobilization often occurs along familial and kinship ties. To state the obvious, organizing to go and fight another group of armed people to the death is a dangerous enterprise. If you're going to do it, you want to do it with people you can trust and who you know will have your back. And most often, the people we trust most are people from our own family and social networks. And in societies with high groupness, These people are almost always members of your ethnic or religious community. Second, identity-based cleavages make it easier for political entrepreneurs, politicians, or prominent community members seeking to further their own interests by promoting conflict, to identify their natural base of supporters and other non-members of the group. Othering is the process of rhetorically heightening the differences between an in-group and an out-group, dehumanizing the members of the latter to the point that the standard nonviolent norms of behavior do not apply to interactions with them. Othering has been central to the justification for and conduct of mass atrocities and violence throughout history, with prominent examples including Nazi promotion of Aryan features and demonization of Jews, Roma, and Poles, and homosexuals, and Hutu agitators referring to Tutsis as cockroaches.
Dimanche 19 juin 1994, et il est 16h22 à Kigali, dans le blindé de la FLN. Avis à tous les Guinéens qui nous écoutent, oui, à tous les Guinéens qui nous écoutent, le Rwanda appartient à ceux qui le défendent vraiment. Et vous, les Guinéens, vous n'êtes pas des Rwandais. Inyenzi Inkotanyi n'ababwiye abasirikare bacu nibo ba mbere babwira urubyiruko rwagutse kugira ngo bafashe abasirikare bacu babwira inkumi babwira abasore murabyumva rero inyenzi ntabwo zishobora gukandira abantu bose umwana tugira iwacu uko ari bake cyane ni bake cyane ndetse nubwo twabariraga ku ijana 10 ku ijana ubwo basigara 8 ku ijana abantu se koko muze twishime nshuti inkotanyi zashize muze twishime nshuti yewe imana ntirenganya koko kuvuga hano biturwana tugatsinda inyenzi inkotanyi burundu nazo dutsinda urubanza n'ububaho kuko ruzaba turarwanya kandi batsinda.
Taken together, these factors indicate we should expect to see more violent environmental conflicts in societies with high demographic environmental stress, weak state capacity and low state legitimacy, high levels of dependence on agricultural livelihoods, and high degrees of groupness. These concepts are fundamental to understanding intrastate environmental conflicts. Next time, we'll dive deeper into the dynamics of domestic environmental conflicts and look at some cases in more detail.